It was late 1943 when a group of German officers, captured in North Africa and transported across the Atlantic, found themselves under escort in a small American town. The war was still raging in Europe, but here on streets lined with neon advertisements and cars parked nose to nose, life moved with a rhythm utterly alien to men who had left behind blackout curtains and ration books. They marched quietly, boots scraping against the pavement, until the guards led them through swinging glass doors. Inside lay a sight that, for a moment, made even hardened veterans lose their words. The supermarket stretched farther than their eyes could immediately comprehend, bright lights steady, unblinking. Free from the fear of enemy bombers, illuminated rows of shelves so perfectly stocked that it seemed staged for a film. One officer later wrote in his diary, "If this were a theater set, I would call it too exaggerated. No city in Europe, not even Paris before the war, had displayed such wealth in food." For men who had grown accustomed to eating black bread laced with sawdust, the sight of white loaves stacked in pyramids felt like mockery. Everywhere they turned, abundance stared back. Mountains of oranges, bananas, and pineapples fruits most had only seen in illustrated magazines lay casually in baskets as if they were common as potatoes. Germany's blockade had made even apples a rarity by 1942. Now tropical fruits, shipped thousands of miles, seemed to mock the very concept of scarcity. One officer reached out, hesitated, then whispered to another, "This is propaganda." The guard chuckled and said nothing. The officers began counting instinctively, their soldiers' minds tallying crates and stacks, imagining how long such reserves could feed divisions at the front. According to quartermaster records, a single American supermarket in 1943 could move more food in a week than an entire German garrison consumed in a month. The numbers alone, if they were true, suggested a logistical capacity Germany had never achieved. But numbers meant little compared to what their eyes told them. Butter, eggs, ham, coffee. The list seemed endless. The silence among them grew heavier than the bright air around. They remembered Berlin queues, where mothers clutched ration cards for a few ounces of margarine. They remembered soldiers at the front who received only turnips and watery soup during winter campaigns, and now an aisle devoted to breakfast cereals alone, another to canned vegetables stacked like ammunition. One officer muttered in disbelief, "We have been deceived. Either our government does not know, or it lies." What disturbed them most was the casualness of the shoppers. Housewives pushed carts without urgency, choosing between brands as if such variety were normal. To the Germans, even one can of peaches could have been considered a treasure, worthy of bribing an officer or smuggling across borders. Yet here, a child tugged at his mother's sleeve, demanding a different flavor. A guard offered one of them a small bottle of Coca-Cola. The officer studied the amber liquid, suspicious. He had heard of it in whispers, described as a frivolous American drink. He twisted the cap, took a cautious sip, and paused. Sweet, effervescent, alive with energy. In that instant, he realized this was not staged theater. This was daily life. And as he lowered the bottle, still fizzing in his hand, he felt the first real crack open inside the fortress of certainty he had carried across the Atlantic. But what awaited them in the next aisle, cold cases humming with endless meat and cheese, would press that crack wider, until belief itself seemed ready to shatter. The hum of refrigeration greeted them as they stepped deeper into the store. What they saw next made the mountains of fruit seem like mere appetizers. Along the left wall stretched a shining sea of canned goods, stacked with military precision, tin after tin, label after label, bright colors promising peaches, corn, beans, soups, coffee. Even dog food, a concept that left some officers murmuring in disbelief. In Germany, scraps barely sufficed for soldiers. Here, food was prepared for animals with packaging that looked finer than what Reich citizens received. Colonel Hans Richter, a career officer raised in the Prussian tradition, stopped mid-step. His diary later recorded, "The enemy's arsenal is not only steel and oil, but shelves that never end. If these tins are real, then their war cannot be exhausted." The numbers bore him out. Quartermaster records showed that in 1943, American factories produced over 40 billion cans of food annually, more than 20 times Germany's wartime output. Each supermarket represented not just a shop, but a node in a vast system of preservation, distribution, and choice. Every label screamed something impossible: fresh milk, chilled butter, bacon slices sealed in paper. Germany had struggled to provide rations even to its elite troops during the winter on the Eastern Front. By contrast, American civilians, untouched by invasion, debated which brand of butter tasted better for the officers. The most painful sight was the surplus entire sections devoted not just to necessity, but preference. A young POW named Eric whispered to his comrade, "If our soldiers saw this, they would ask why they bled at Stalingrad." His words hung heavy in the cold air of the meat section. Behind glass counters, thick steaks lay marbled and red, sausages coiled like ropes, cheese blocks taller than helmets. In Berlin, one could barter a gold ring for a few ounces of butter. Here, a boy spent pocket change for cheese he might not even finish. The officers had been taught that American abundance was an illusion, carefully staged for propaganda photographs. Yet the logistics they observed went beyond illusion. They watched clerks restocking shelves at a pace that suggested warehouses overflowing just blocks away. Trucks arrived daily, engines rumbling, unloading crates that disappeared into the back rooms. According to shipping manifests later studied, even a small-town supermarket in Texas received more weekly deliveries of meat and grain than the German Sixth Army had at the height of its campaign in Russia. Numbers spoke more clearly than speeches. The Reich had no answer to such rivers of supply. One officer clenched his fists behind his back. If one of these stores existed in Berlin during the blockade, the people would never question the Führer. They would adore him. Here, they do not even notice what they have. As they turned the corner of the aisle, the officers expected the pattern to repeat: shelves of food, overwhelming in variety. Yet what caught their attention next was not what was stacked, but what illuminated it. Overhead glowed rows of fluorescent tubes, unblinking, steady as daylight. The light was so bright it made the cans shimmer as though they were precious metals. For men raised under nightly blackouts, where a cigarette's ember could draw an air raid, such uninterrupted brilliance felt almost supernatural. And though they tried to focus on food, they could not shake the realization that the very lights above their heads carried another lesson, one that would hit harder than meat or fruit. The officers moved on, but their eyes kept drifting upward. Light bathed every corner of the supermarket. Shadows banished as if the sun itself had been captured and forced to serve indoors. It was not the flickering gas lamps of their childhood, nor the weak bulbs they remembered from Berlin before the war. These were fluorescent tubes, long, white, and mercilessly bright. For men drilled to live under blackout curtains. It was like stepping into another planet. In Germany, entire districts fell dark at the sound of sirens. Cities had been dimmed to shadows, factories concealed beneath camouflage nets, and street lamps extinguished by decree. Here, in wartime America, the supermarket glowed with the confidence of a nation that feared no nightly raid. Lieutenant Karl Brenner, who had once coordinated logistics in occupied France, murmured, "One bulb here burns longer than our lamps in the command post. If this light is real, then so is their power." Then came another sound, a constant, low hum. Rising from the refrigerated cases along the walls, fans spun invisibly. Compressors kicked in with a pulse, and the officers realized that the meats and dairy were not left to spoil. They were preserved day and night by a hidden force they could only guess at. In 1943, America consumed over 170 billion kilowatt hours of electricity annually, more than the entire Axis combined. Germany, crippled by coal shortages and bombed-out plants, rationed current so tightly that factories often shut down at dusk. The Reich built tanks and planes, but its cities flickered uncertainly, electricity drained by the war machine. By contrast, here was power spent casually on milk, butter, and ice cream. One officer pressed his palm against the cold glass, and for the first time in years, felt the chill of abundance. The statistics staggered them as much as the light. America had more than 2,000 power plants operating by mid-war, some so vast that a single one consumed more coal than the Ruhr Valley in a month. One Tennessee facility produced enough current to light all of Berlin. They had been told that the Reich would triumph through discipline, through sacrifice. But what discipline could match a system that casually froze thousands of pounds of meat for civilians while still fueling fleets of bombers, tanks, and ships abroad? Colonel Richter, the eldest among them, whispered bitterly, "If every household in America shines like this, then we are fighting not an army, but a continent of light." The officers turned to leave the dairy section, but something else stole their attention. Through the wide glass doors at the back of the store, they saw a truck reverse into the loading dock. Its cargo was crates of butter and milk, delivered as casually as one might deliver coal. The men glanced at each other. In Germany, trains starved for coal. In Russia, whole divisions had perished for lack of bread. Yet here, refrigerated trucks rolled daily into small towns, their engines humming with the promise that the shelves would never empty. They exchanged no further words. For how could any doctrine of scarcity survive in a land where power and transport pulsed together like the twin arteries of empire? And still, they had seen only the beginning. For beyond light and refrigeration lay something even greater, the machinery of movement that carried this abundance across a continent wider than Europe itself. The loading dock doors swung open, and the German officers watched as workers unloaded crate after crate of milk, butter, and fruit. The truck itself seemed unremarkable to American eyes, painted in company colors, its trailer insulated for cold storage, but to men accustomed to scarcity, it was a revelation. It was not a military convoy, not a government ration truck. It was one of thousands, part of a civilian network that ran with the punctuality of an army and the scale of an empire. In Germany, trains clogged with troop movements and coal shortages had already reduced civilian supply to a trickle. By late 1942, entire provinces had endured weeks without consistent bread deliveries. Here, in wartime America, refrigerated trucks arrived daily at every small-town supermarket. Lieutenant Brenner's diary later captured his astonishment. The food moved faster than armies. We calculated supply lines by weeks. They moved by hours. Beyond the truck, the POWs began to understand the greater system feeding the store. America's highways stretched like arteries across thousands of miles, binding city to countryside, farm to supermarket. By 1943, the nation boasted more than 700,000 miles of paved road, and alongside them ran 250,000 miles of railroad track. In Germany, even strategic rail lines had fallen prey to Allied bombing, and locomotives sat idle for lack of fuel. But in the United States, trains roared across the continent, hauling wheat from Kansas, beef from Nebraska, fruit from California, and steel from Pittsburgh. One statistic later included in their reports was devastating. An American freight train could haul more in a single trip than an entire German division consumed in a week. Colonel Richter whispered to his comrades, "Our Reich can invade countries, but these people have invaded distance itself." The scale was incomprehensible. In 1943 alone, American railroads moved more than 745 billion ton-miles of freight. Compare that to Germany's struggling 60 billion, even if the Wehrmacht captured Moscow or Cairo. How could they ever match an enemy whose very transport capacity dwarfed entire continents? The officers had been raised on the legend of Blitzkrieg, where rapid armored thrusts outpaced the enemy's ability to respond. But here was a different kind of Blitzkrieg, one of locomotives, trucks, and ships, hurling not shells, but food and supplies at speeds no army could resist. A POW named Eric muttered to himself as a child skipped past with a paper bag of groceries. If they can move bread so fast, how fast can they move tanks? As the truck drove off and another pulled in, the officers realized they had still not seen the true source of this abundance. The shelves and trucks were only the final link in a chain, somewhere beyond the horizon. Factories canned the peaches, dairies bottled the milk, slaughterhouses packed the beef. Behind those factories stretched farms so large that they made the German estates of barons look like gardens. The officers had stepped into one store, yet the real power lay in thousands of others, supplied each day without pause. And so their unease deepened, for they knew if this was the surface, then what lay beneath must be larger than anything they had ever imagined. What awaited them next, the revelation of factories and farms beyond their wildest comprehension, would turn silent disbelief into a crushing certainty of defeat. The supermarket had stunned them. But the guards, half amused at their disbelief, took the officers further on another day. They were transported past the edge of town, where the streets gave way to sprawling fields and distant silhouettes of factories. If the supermarket was the mouth of the system, here lay its beating heart. Smoke rose from chimneys taller than church spires, their plumes stretching into the horizon. The low thunder of machinery echoed across the fields. Through open doors, WWIIs, they glimpsed endless assembly lines, conveyors rolling cans, stamping lids, and boxing crates with mechanical precision. A single plant produced more canned food in a day than Germany could in a month. Lieutenant Brenner stared as forklifts shuttled pallets stacked like fortress walls. "This is war by machine," he whispered. "Our soldiers fight with bayonets. Their housewives fight with factories." By 1943, America's agricultural output was staggering, over 23 million tons of canned goods, 16 billion pounds of beef, and 4 billion pounds of butter flowed annually into civilian and military supply. Farms averaged hundreds, sometimes thousands of acres, whereas in Germany, fragmented plots struggled under fuel shortages and draft animals pressed back into service. One officer scribbled bitterly in his journal, "A Kansas farm can feed more mouths than all of Saxony. What Reich can stand against a single state that grows more wheat than Europe?" The comparison burned like salt. Germany's proud Junker estates, symbols of aristocratic tradition, were dwarfed by American family farms run by ordinary men with tractors larger than German artillery pieces. It was not just land, but machines. Tractors plowed fields night and day, powered by gasoline in a nation that produced 2/3 of the world's oil. Harvesters cut wheat with mechanical arms. Reapers bundled corn in towering stacks, where German farmers bent their backs with hand tools. Americans drove machines that multiplied their labor 100-fold. Factories tied directly to these farms ensured nothing went to waste. Grain became bread, fruit became jam, meat became canned stew, all preserved, labeled, and shipped within days. A closed loop of industry and agriculture that seemed almost invincible. Colonel Richter looked at the horizon, where farmland melted into smokestacks. "They are not fighting us with armies alone," he muttered. "They are fighting with a continent." As the convoy rolled back toward town, one of the officers noticed another building by the roadside, a facility bearing the symbol of a Red Cross. Trucks unloaded not food this time, but crates of medical supplies, bandages, penicillin, morphine. It dawned on them that abundance was not limited to food and steel. America's factories were also turning out medicines by the ton, miracles that German soldiers could only dream of at the front. If the farms and factories ensured Americans never went hungry, the hospitals ensured they rarely died of infection. And as the officers exchanged uneasy glances, they realized the abundance of food was only the first blow. The abundance of medicine and care would strike even deeper at their certainty. The officers returned to their quarters that night restless, their diaries filling with lines that no censor in Berlin would have allowed. What they had seen could not be squared with the Reich's vision of a decadent, collapsing America, instead of poverty and chaos. They had walked through supermarkets brighter than any hall in Berlin, factories louder than any parade ground, and farms vaster than any noble estate. The question gnawed at them: if even civilians lived with such abundance, what reserves of strength waited behind the American armies? Lieutenant Brenner wrote in secret, "We were told they are weak. Yet if weakness produces this plenty, then what does strength look like?" The words revealed what they all feared to admit. The foundation of their ideology was crumbling. One young officer, Erich, had grown up in Hamburg, where Allied bombings turned whole blocks to ash. His mother queued for hours to receive a few ounces of butter. That memory collided violently with the sight of American children tossing half-finished sandwiches into bins outside the store. He could not reconcile it. "My mother would weep if she saw this waste," he whispered. For Erich, the war had been framed as a struggle for survival, a desperate defense against starvation. But here, food was so abundant it bordered on indifference. Colonel Richter, older and more rigid, clung longer to silence. Yet even he felt the tremor. He had built his career on discipline and obedience, but as he stared at the glowing lights outside the barracks window, he muttered, "If this is their ordinary life, then our extraordinary struggle cannot prevail." Reports circulated among the prisoners. American production had reached levels previously unthinkable. 96,000 planes built in 1944, one Liberty ship launched every 3 days, wheat harvests topping 1.2 billion bushels. These figures, whispered from guard to POW, were not propaganda. They matched the reality the officers had seen in a single supermarket. The numbers did not exaggerate, they confirmed. How could the Reich sustain itself when a single American farm fed more soldiers than an entire German province? How could ideology prevail when one factory outproduced a whole nation's worth of industry? The officers found themselves cornered by arithmetic, and numbers, unlike speeches, did not lie. As Christmas approached, the officers expected only silence and cold. Instead, they watched American families deliver parcels to the POW camp: tobacco, sweets, even knitted scarves, to men trained to see the enemy as monstrous. This unexpected generosity struck deeper than statistics. For one brief moment, Eric held in his hands a red apple wrapped in ribbon. He stared at it longer than he had ever stared at a weapon. They fight with plenty, and they fight with kindness. What is left to us, he wrote. The Reich had commanded them to believe in sacrifice, in scarcity as virtue. But here, in the land of lights and shelves without end, they found an enemy who wielded abundance as both weapon and proof. And so the cracks spread wider until belief itself seemed no stronger than paper in a storm.